The wind howled through the bare branches of the oak trees surrounding St. Mary's Church, their skeletal limbs scratching against the wooden walls like the fingers of restless spirits seeking entrance to hallowed ground. In the small town of Millbrook, Virginia, nestled in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the scars of war still marked every street corner and every weathered face, midnight brought a different kind of darkness, one that seemed to seep into the very souls of those who had survived the bloodshed that had torn the nation apart. Margaret Caldwell pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood before the heavy wooden door of the church, its iron hinges blackened with age and its surface scarred by decades of faithful hands seeking comfort within its walls. Her breath formed small, ghostly clouds in the frigid October air of 1866, and her hands trembled, not entirely from the cold that bit through her worn woolen dress, but from the weight of the terrible knowledge that had driven her from her bed and through the empty streets to this sacred place where she hoped to find answers to questions that had been burning in her chest like hot coals. The widow's once gentle features had been carved sharp by grief and hardship, her brown eyes now holding depths of sorrow that seemed to echo the empty spaces where her husband and 2 sons once filled her world with laughter and warmth. At 42, Margaret had the hollow-cheeked look of someone who had forgotten how to eat properly, who had spent too many nights staring at the ceiling and too many days moving through the motions of living without really being alive. If you're finding this story as compelling as I hope, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Your support means everything to us, and I'd love to hear from our community around the world as we explore these untold stories of courage and heartbreak from our nation's most defining period. The brass knocker felt like ice beneath her palm as she raised it, hesitating for just a moment as she considered the magnitude of what she was about to do. Once she knocked on this door, once she spoke the words that had been clawing at her throat for the past 24 hours, there would be no returning to the comfortable lies that had sustained her through the darkest months of her widowhood. But the alternative, living with this knowledge alone, carrying these questions that threatened to drive her mad, seemed impossible to bear. She let the knocker fall against the door with 3 deliberate strikes that seemed to echo through the entire valley, cutting through the stillness like a blade and announcing to whatever spirits might be listening that Margaret Caldwell had reached the end of her endurance. The sound reverberated off the stone foundations of the church and seemed to hang in the air long after the metal had stopped moving, as if the very night was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Father Thomas McKenna had been the shepherd of this small flock for nearly 2 decades, watching boys grow into soldiers and then burying far too many of them in the churchyard behind the sanctuary, where weathered headstones now stood like silent sentinels marking the graves of an entire generation. At 53, his once dark hair had turned silver at the temples, and lines of weariness etched his face like a map of all the confessions he had heard, all the last rites he had administered, all the tears he had wiped away with hands that had trembled from their own hidden burdens. The war had aged him in ways that time alone never could, carving away the easy certainties of his younger years and replacing them with a bone-deep understanding of how quickly good men could be driven to desperate choices. His congregation had dwindled as young men marched off to war, and those who returned came back changed, carrying shadows in their eyes that spoke of things too terrible to put into words during Sunday sermons. When the knocking came, he was sitting in his modest quarters beside the church, staring into the dying embers of his fire and wrestling with demons that had plagued him for months, demons that whispered accusations in the darkness and reminded him of choices he had made that would haunt him until his dying day. The sound startled him from his dark reverie, and he glanced at the old wooden clock on his mantel, its pendulum marking time with the steady rhythm of a funeral march, midnight. No good news ever came at such an hour, he had learned through bitter experience. Midnight visitors brought word of deaths, of scandals, of secrets that could no longer be contained within the hearts of those who carried them. He had learned to dread the sound of knocking after the sun had set, knowing that it usually meant someone's world was about to collapse, and that he would be expected to help pick up the pieces. He wrapped his wool coat around his nightshirt and made his way through the connecting door that led directly into the sanctuary, his bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. The church felt cavernous in the darkness, the wooden pews casting long shadows in the moonlight that filtered through the stained glass windows that had somehow survived the war intact while so much else lay in ruins, their colored glass depicting scenes of biblical suffering that seemed almost prophetic now. The altar stood at the far end of the sanctuary, draped in white cloth and adorned with silver candlesticks that gleamed in the pale light. Above it hung a wooden crucifix carved by local craftsmen decades earlier, its painted figure of Christ looking down with an expression of infinite compassion and infinite sorrow. Father McKenna had stared at that face countless times during the war years, searching for guidance that seemed increasingly difficult to find. "Who calls upon God's house at this hour?" Father McKenna asked through the thick door, his voice carrying the authority of his position despite the uncertainty that churned in his stomach like acid. He had learned to project confidence even when he felt none, to speak with the voice of spiritual leadership even when his own faith felt as fragile as autumn leaves. "Father, it's Margaret Caldwell," came the reply, her voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying the weight of mountains. The words seemed to float through the wooden barrier between them, laden with a desperation that made the priest's heart constrict with foreboding. "I must speak with you, please. I cannot wait until morning." The priest's hand froze on the iron latch, his blood suddenly running cold as winter rain. Margaret Caldwell, widow of Thomas Caldwell, who had fallen at Bull Run in the first terrible year of the war, mother to James and Samuel Caldwell, both killed at Gettysburg during those 3 brutal days that had claimed so many of their town's young men. She had been a pillar of their small community once, known throughout Millbrook for her kindness and her gentle way with the sick and injured, her home always open to those in need of comfort or counsel. But since losing her family in the space of 2 years, she had become something of a ghost herself, rarely seen except on Sundays when she occupied the same pew she had shared with her loved ones, her lips moving in silent prayers that seemed to echo with desperation. She had grown thin and pale, her once bright smile replaced by a haunted expression that spoke of sleepless nights and meals forgotten in favor of more pressing sorrows. The other widows in town had tried to reach out to her, but Margaret had retreated into a solitude that seemed impenetrable. Father McKenna turned the heavy latch and opened the door to find her standing in a pool of silver moonlight, her dark mourning dress hanging loose on her diminished frame like a garment borrowed from someone else's life. She had always been a handsome woman, with the kind of quiet beauty that came from contentment and good humor, but grief had carved away everything soft about her, leaving behind angles and shadows that spoke of a soul that had been scraped raw by loss. Her dark hair, once lustrous and carefully arranged, was now streaked with premature grey and pulled back in a simple knot that emphasized the sharp lines of her cheekbones. Her hands, which he remembered as being gentle and sure when she tended to the sick or prepared meals for church gatherings, now appeared almost skeletal in the moonlight. The wedding ring she still wore loose on her finger, as if even her bones had shrunk with grief. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said gently, stepping aside to allow her entry into the sanctuary. "Come in, child. You're freezing out there, and this night is far too cold for anyone to be wandering the streets alone." She moved past him with careful, measured steps, as if she were walking across ice that might crack at any moment and send her plunging into depths she might never escape. The interior of the church embraced her with familiar scents, candle wax, old wood, and something indefinable that she had always associated with sanctuary and safety. But tonight, even this sacred space felt different, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle with apprehension and set her nerves on edge. The wooden floors creaked softly beneath their feet as Father McKenna guided her toward the front of the church, past pews that held the memories of countless Sunday mornings when her family had sat together, her sons fidgeting during long sermons while her husband's strong hand rested protectively on her shoulder. Those days seemed like something from another lifetime now, so distant that they might have belonged to someone else entirely. "Forgive me for coming at such an hour, Father," Margaret began, her voice steady despite the way her hands shook like leaves in a storm. "But I couldn't wait until morning. I couldn't spend another night carrying this burden alone, couldn't lie in that empty bed for another moment knowing what I know now." The priest guided her to a pew near the front, where a statue of the Virgin Mary gazed down upon them with painted eyes full of compassion, her blue robes seeming to shimmer in the candlelight that flickered from the altar. He had counseled many widows through their grief over the years, had held their hands as they wept for husbands and sons who would never return home, had offered what comfort he could to women whose worlds had been shattered by war and loss. But something in Margaret's bearing tonight was different. There was a brittle quality to her composure that suggested she was balanced on the edge of a precipice, one wrong word away from shattering completely like glass struck by a hammer. Her usual quiet dignity had been replaced by something that seemed almost dangerous in its intensity, as if grief had transformed her into something harder and more volatile than the gentle woman he had known. "What troubles you, my child?" Father McKenna asked, settling beside her on the worn wooden bench that had been polished smooth by decades of faithful hands. The pew creaked under their combined weight, and he could smell the faint scent of lavender that still clung to her clothes, a reminder of happier times when she had tended her garden and filled her home with flowers. "Has something happened? Has someone brought you distressing news?" Margaret stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, for a long moment before she spoke. Her knuckles were white with the force of her grip, as if she were holding onto her composure through sheer physical effort. When she did finally break the silence, her words came slowly, carefully measured, as if she were pulling each one from some deep, painful place within herself that she had never allowed anyone else to see. "Father, I've discovered something about Thomas. About my husband's death, about the life we shared, about everything I thought I knew about the man I loved for 15 years. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and in them he saw a pain so raw and fresh that it took his breath away, pain that seemed to burn like fire in the depths of her gaze. "I need to know if what I've learned is true. And I need to know what God expects of me now that my entire world has been revealed to be built on lies." "Lal." The priest felt his mouth go dry as dust, his tongue suddenly feeling too large for his mouth. In the months following the war's end, many secrets had come to light, letters that revealed affairs that had been conducted while husbands were away fighting, debts that had been hidden from families, allegiances that had been concealed behind masks of patriotic fervor. Families had been torn apart by revelations that somehow seemed more devastating than the actual battles that had already taken so much from them. But there was something in Margaret's tone, something in the way she held herself, that suggested her discovery was of a magnitude that dwarfed the usual wartime deceptions. This was not about hidden debts or momentary lapses in fidelity. This was about something that struck at the very foundation of who she believed herself to be. "Tell me what you've discovered," he said quietly, though every instinct warned him that he might not want to hear what she had to say. The words seemed to echo in the vast space above them, bouncing off the arched ceiling and returning to them changed, laden with portent and dread. Margaret reached into the small cloth bag she carried and withdrew a letter, its edges worn soft from repeated handling. The paper was stained and creased, as if it had traveled a great distance through many hands before finding its way to her kitchen table, where she had read it by candlelight until the words were burned into her memory like brands. "This came to me yesterday morning," she said, holding the letter as if it were made of the most fragile glass and might crumble at the slightest touch. "It was brought by a soldier, a Union sergeant named William Hayes, who said he had been searching for me for over a year, following leads from one town to another until he finally tracked me to Millbrook." She paused, gathering her courage for what was to come. "He said he had been carrying this letter since the autumn of 1862, waiting for the war to end, so he could deliver it personally. He said it was found in a Confederate soldier's jacket after the Battle of Antietam, along with several other personal effects and documents that painted a picture he thought I needed to see." Father McKenna accepted the letter when she offered it to him with trembling hands, noting how his own fingers had begun to shake as if in sympathy with her distress. The paper was addressed to "My beloved Margaret," in handwriting that was educated and careful, each letter formed with the precision of someone who had been well schooled in penmanship but was writing under conditions of great emotional duress. "It's not from Thomas," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she forced herself to speak the words that had been burning inside her like poison for the past day and night. "It's from Captain Jonathan Hartwell of the 15th Virginia Infantry, a Confederate officer I'd never heard of before yesterday, a name that meant nothing to me until I read what he had written." The priest unfolded the letter carefully, mindful of its fragile condition and the way Margaret watched his every movement, as if her life depended on his reaction. As his eyes began to move across the page, taking in the faded ink and the careful script, he felt his stomach clench with each word, like a fist closing around his vital organs. "My beloved Margaret, by the time you read this letter, I will likely be dead, and perhaps that is for the best. I cannot bear to live with the knowledge of what I have done, with the weight of the lies that have shaped our love and your marriage to a man who never truly existed outside of the fiction I created to escape my own cowardice. You know me not as Jonathan Hartwell, but as Thomas Caldwell, the name I took when I deserted from the Confederate Army in the winter of 1860, months before the war began in earnest, when it was becoming clear that our nation was rushing toward a conflict that would test every man's conscience and courage. I was a coward then, afraid of what was coming, afraid of the choice I would be forced to make between my loyalty to Virginia and my moral objections to the institution of slavery that was tearing our nation apart like wolves fighting over a carcass. I fled to your small town, where no one knew my face or my shame, and I built a life on foundations of deception that I told myself were justified by my love for you. I fell in love with you, truly, deeply, completely, but I fell in love with a woman who believed she was marrying an honorable man named Thomas Caldwell, a farmer and carpenter with calloused hands and an honest heart. Not a deserter and a liar named Jonathan Hartwell, who had abandoned his post rather than face the consequences of his beliefs. Father McKenna looked up from the letter to find Margaret watching him with eyes that seemed to hold all the pain in the world, eyes that had seen too much and understood too well the magnitude of betrayal that human beings were capable of inflicting upon those they claimed to love. "Keep reading," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind rattling the church windows. "It gets much worse before it's finished. When the war came to our doorstep, when Virginia seceded and every able-bodied man was expected to take up arms for one side or the other, I had no choice but to enlist under the name Thomas Caldwell and hope that my past would never catch up with me. I thought I could serve honorably, could somehow redeem my earlier cowardice by fighting bravely for the Union cause that aligned with my conscience, if not with my birth. But fate has a way of punishing deception, my darling. In the spring of 1862, I was recognized by a fellow officer from my original Confederate unit, a man named Captain Reynolds, who remembered Jonathan Hartwell and was more than happy to use his knowledge of my true identity for his own purposes. He gave me a choice that was no choice at all, serve as his spy within the Union ranks, feeding information about troop movements and battle plans to Confederate forces, or see you and our boys branded as the family of a deserter and traitor. I chose treason over truth, Margaret. I chose to betray the very cause I fought beside, rather than let you and James and Samuel suffer for my cowardice. For 2 long years, I have passed information to Confederate forces while wearing Union blue, have sent good men to their deaths, men who trusted me as their comrade, men who died believing they were betrayed by their enemies, when in truth they were betrayed by the man who ate beside them and shared their campfires and listened to them talk about their sweethearts back home. The priest's hands were shaking so violently now that he could barely hold the letter steady enough to continue reading. He had known Thomas Caldwell personally, had baptized his sons when they were babies, had counseled him through difficult times when drought threatened his crops or when money was tight, had admired his dedication to his family and his apparent courage in enlisting, despite his age, when younger men were already filling the ranks. To learn that the man he had respected and trusted, the man whose family he had comforted in grief, had been living such an elaborate lie and had been directly responsible for the deaths of other soldiers, was almost too much for his mind to accept. But Margaret was not finished with her revelations, and her eyes demanded that he continue reading until he had absorbed the full scope of the deception that had shaped her life. Our sons, James and Samuel, died fighting for the Union with honor and courage, never knowing that their father was selling their comrades' lives to save his own reputation. They died as heroes while I lived as a traitor, and every night I am haunted by the thought that some of the intelligence I provided may have contributed to the very battles where they fell. I may have helped plan the strategies that killed my own children, Margaret. That is the depth of the hell I have created for myself. I want you to know that every moment of happiness we shared, every laugh, every tender word, every night I held you in my arms, all of it was real, even though it was built on a foundation of lies. The man who loved you was the truest part of Jonathan Hartwell, the only part of me that was worth preserving. Thomas Caldwell may have been a fiction, but his love for you was the most honest thing in his life. Father McKenna felt the letter slip from his numb fingers to fall onto the wooden floor between them, with a soft whisper of paper against wood. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the sound of wind rattling the church windows and the distant howling of a dog somewhere in the town below, its mournful cry seeming to echo the anguish that filled the sacred space where they sat. "Mrs. Caldwell," he began, then stopped, having no idea what words could possibly address the magnitude of what she had shared with him. The conventional phrases of comfort that he had used countless times before seemed pathetically inadequate in the face of such devastating betrayal. "Margaret, I cannot imagine how you must be feeling. To learn that your entire marriage, your family's entire life, was built on such deception. But that's not why I'm here," she said, cutting him off with a voice like steel that had been tempered in fire and emerged harder than it had been before. "I didn't come here at midnight to share my grief with you, Father, or to seek comfort for my wounded heart. I came because of what else that soldier told me, what he revealed about the web of lies and betrayal that apparently extended far beyond my husband's deception." She turned to face him fully now, and in her eyes he saw not just pain and betrayal, but a terrible, burning need for truth that would not be denied or deflected. It was the look of someone who had been pushed beyond the limits of what they could bear and had emerged on the other side with nothing left to lose. "What he told me about you, Father McKenna." The priest felt his blood turn to ice in his veins, felt his heart begin to race like that of a rabbit that has suddenly realized it is trapped in a hunter's snare. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his own secrets began to crack and crumble, and he found himself unable to meet her penetrating gaze. Margaret reached into her bag again and withdrew a second document, this one bearing the official seal of the Union Army. Her movements were precise and deliberate, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times over the past day and night. Sergeant Hayes told me that he had served under Captain Reynolds, the same Captain Reynolds who had blackmailed my husband into treason. He told me that before Reynolds died at Fredericksburg, cut down by Confederate sharpshooters in a moment of bitter irony, he had confessed to several fellow officers about the network of spies and informants he had cultivated throughout Virginia. She unfolded the document with hands that were now steady with purpose rather than shaking with emotion. Reynolds kept detailed records, Father. Names, dates, the specific information that was passed along and the consequences that followed. He was thorough in his documentation, perhaps because he understood that such knowledge might be valuable if he ever needed to protect himself from accusations of his own. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle between them like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that would spread outward and change everything they touched. Your name was in those records, Father Thomas McKenna. Reynolds documented how he had been blackmailing you as well, forcing you to pass information about Union troop movements and supply lines that you gathered from confessions and conversations with soldiers who sought counsel from their priest. The truth hit Father McKenna like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and sending waves of nausea through his stomach that threatened to double him over. For months, he had carried this secret like a cancer eating away at his soul, had wrestled with the knowledge that his cowardice and moral weakness had contributed to the deaths of good men who had trusted him with their deepest fears and most private thoughts. He had convinced himself that no one else would ever know, that he could somehow find a way to atone for his sins in private through prayer and penance and quiet acts of service that might somehow balance the scales of his guilt. But now, Margaret Caldwell sat before him, this broken woman who had already lost everything, demanding an accounting that he was not prepared to give and holding evidence that made denial impossible. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice barely audible, even in the profound silence of the empty church. "Please, let me explain what happened. Let me tell you how I became trapped in that web of deceit and compromise." "Explain?" she said, her voice rising for the first time since she had entered the church, the word echoing off the stone walls and wooden beams like an accusation shouted from the mountaintops. "Explain how you used the sacred trust of confession to gather intelligence for the enemy. Explain how you sent my sons and my neighbors' sons to their deaths based on information they gave you in confidence, believing they were speaking to God through his servant." She stood up from the pew, with a movement so sudden and forceful that it seemed to fill the entire space around her with the energy of her rage. Her slight frame somehow commanded the vast sanctuary, her presence expanding to fill every corner and shadow, as if her anger had given her a supernatural power that made her larger than her physical form. "Explain how you stood in that pulpit Sunday after Sunday for 2 long years, preaching about honor and sacrifice and the will of God, while secretly serving the very forces that were killing our boys, while taking the money from our collection plates to fund your comfortable life, even as you sold the lives of our children to purchase your own safety." Father McKenna couldn't meet her eyes, couldn't bear to see the contempt and disgust that he knew must be blazing there like fire. The shame that had been eating at him for months now threatened to consume him entirely, to reduce him to ash and cinders that would blow away on the first strong wind. It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he said, his voice breaking like that of a child caught in some terrible mischief. "Captain Reynolds, he knew about something from my past, something that happened before I came to Millbrook, something that would have destroyed not just me but the entire parish if it had become known." He forced himself to look up at her, to meet her burning gaze with eyes that were streaming with tears that reflected the moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows. He said if I didn't help him, He would expose everything, would reveal the scandal that would drive away what little comfort and stability this community had left. After so much loss, after so much suffering, I couldn't bear to take away the one source of solace that people had remaining. I told myself I was protecting the church, protecting all of you. So you chose to preserve your reputation by betraying your sacred vows. Margaret's voice was like a knife now, sharp and precise, cutting through his justifications and excuses to expose the raw truth beneath. Just as my husband chose to preserve his reputation by betraying his comrades and his cause. She began to pace back and forth in front of the altar, her dark dress rustling against the wooden floor, her movements restless and predatory, like those of a caged animal that has finally seen a way to escape its prison. "Tell me, Father, what was this terrible secret that Reynolds held over you? What sin from your past was so shameful that you were willing to become complicit in murder to keep it hidden?" The priest looked down at his hands, gnarled with age and trembling with emotion, hands that had blessed bread and wine countless times, that had anointed the sick and closed the eyes of the dead, hands that had also written intelligence reports that led to the deaths of innocent men. "I was not always a priest," he said quietly, his voice so low that Margaret had to stop her pacing and lean closer to hear him. "Before I felt the calling to serve God, I lived a very different life. I was married, Margaret. I had a wife and 2 children in Richmond." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she began to understand the implications of his confession. "I abandoned them," he continued, each word seeming to cause him physical pain to speak. "When my business failed and I was facing bankruptcy and scandal, when creditors were threatening to take everything we owned, I fled in the night like a coward. I left my wife to face the consequences alone, left my children to grow up believing their father was dead rather than simply a man who was too weak to face his responsibilities." The silence that followed was so complete that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like drums announcing the end of the world. "I came to Virginia, changed my name, claimed to have felt a religious calling, and convinced the church hierarchy to accept me as a candidate for the priesthood. I built a new life on the foundation of abandoning my family, just as your husband built his new life on the foundation of desertion and deception." Margaret sank back down onto the pew, suddenly feeling as if all the strength had drained out of her legs. The magnitude of the betrayals she was uncovering seemed to expand with each revelation, like ripples spreading outward from a stone thrown into a pond, touching every aspect of her life and the lives of everyone around her. "Your family," she whispered. "What happened to them?" Father McKenna's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs as he answered. "My wife died in poverty 3 years after I left. My children, a boy and a girl, were taken in by relatives who told them their father had died in a railway accident. Reynolds had somehow discovered all of this, had tracked down records and witnesses who could verify my true identity and my abandonment of my family." He looked up at the crucifix hanging above the altar, at the painted face of Christ that seemed to gaze down at him with infinite sadness and disappointment. He threatened to expose not only my past, but the fact that my ordination was based on lies, that I had never been legitimately consecrated as a priest because my entire application was fraudulent. The scandal would have closed this church, Margaret. It would have left this entire community without spiritual guidance at the very moment when they needed it most. So Margaret felt a bitter laugh escape her lips, a sound so harsh and empty that it seemed to echo strangely in the sacred space around them. "So you preserved the church by defiling everything it stands for," she said. "You maintained your position as spiritual leader by betraying the very people who looked to you for guidance and protection. How many men died because of the information you passed along, Father? How many widows like me are mourning husbands who might still be alive if you had chosen honor over self-preservation?" The priest finally looked up at her, his face streaked with tears that gleamed silver in the moonlight, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "I told myself I was being careful," he said, his voice breaking with each word. "I convinced myself that the information I passed along was harmless, that I was sharing only details that couldn't really hurt anyone. I thought I could walk the line between cooperation and betrayal, could give Reynolds just enough to satisfy him without truly compromising the safety of our soldiers." "But you were wrong," Margaret said, not asking a question but stating a fact with the certainty of someone who had already seen the evidence. "Men died because of what you told Captain Reynolds, didn't they?" The silence that stretched between them was filled with the weight of unspoken confessions and unbearable truths. Father McKenna's shoulders sagged as if he were carrying a physical burden too heavy for his frame, and when he finally nodded, the gesture seemed to take all of his remaining strength. "Yes," he whispered, the word barely audible above the sound of wind howling around the church walls. "Yes, men died because of me. Good men, brave men, men who trusted me with their fears and their plans and their hopes for returning home to their families." He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with the force of his anguish. There was a planned attack on a Confederate supply depot in the spring of 1863. 3 soldiers came to me for confession the night before, nervous about the dangerous mission they were about to undertake. They spoke of their routes, their timing, their numbers, details I should have kept sacred, should have taken to my grave rather than betray. Margaret felt her stomach clench as she began to understand the full scope of his complicity. I passed that information to Reynolds, telling myself that it was just intelligence about supply lines, nothing that would directly endanger the soldiers themselves. But the Confederates were waiting for them, Margaret. They ambushed our boys in a narrow valley where there was no escape, where they were cut down like wheat before a scythe. He looked up at her with eyes that held depths of guilt and self-loathing that seemed almost bottomless. 14 men died in that ambush, including 2 boys from this very town, Peter Morrison and David Webb, both barely 18 years old, both with sweethearts waiting for them back home. Their blood is on my hands, as surely as if I had pulled the triggers myself. Margaret stood up again, moving to stand directly in front of him, her shadow falling across his face like a judgment passed down from on high. "Do you know?" she said quietly, her voice now completely without emotion, as if she had moved beyond feeling into some cold clinical place where pain couldn't touch her. "What the cruelest part of all this is, Father?" He shook his head, not trusting his voice to remain steady enough to speak. "The cruelest part is that I still love him. Despite everything I've learned tonight, despite the lies and the betrayal and the knowledge that our entire marriage was built on deception, I still love the man I thought was Thomas Caldwell. I still wake up reaching for him in the night. I still hear his voice calling my name when I'm working in the garden. I still smell his scent on his clothes that I haven't been able to bring myself to give away." Her voice finally broke on the last words, and Father McKenna saw tears streaming down her face. The first tears she had shed since entering the church, tears that seemed to carry with them all the accumulated pain and confusion of the past day and night. "And I hate myself for it," she continued, her voice thick with anguish. "I hate that I can't simply stop loving him now that I know the truth. I hate that learning about his deception hasn't set me free from grief, but has instead trapped me in a kind of limbo, where I don't know what to mourn or who to grieve for or how to make sense of any of it." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a gesture that seemed almost childlike in its simplicity and vulnerability. "When I learned that my sons died fighting honorably while their father was betraying everything they believed in, I thought the pain would kill me. But when I learned that you, the man who baptized them, who heard their first confessions, who blessed them when they left for war, when I learned that you were complicit in sending them to their deaths, that pain became something else entirely." Father McKenna reached out tentatively, his hand hovering near hers, as if he wanted to offer comfort, but didn't dare to actually touch her. "Margaret," he said softly, drawing on something deeper than his own compromised wisdom, "what your husband did, what I did, none of it diminishes the love you shared with him, or the pride you can take in your son's courage. The man you fell in love with, the father who raised your boys with tenderness and care, the husband who held you when you cried and celebrated with you when you laughed. That person was real, even if his name and his history were false." She looked at him through her tears, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that might have been hope struggling to surface through all the pain and betrayal. "How can you say that?" she asked. "How can love be real when everything else was false? How can I trust any of my feelings when they were all based on lies?" Father McKenna stood up from the pew and moved to stand beside her, both of them now facing the altar where candles flickered in red glass holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to writhe and pulse with life of their own. "Because love transcends the details of our lives," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke words that he desperately needed to believe himself. "Love exists in spite of deception, not because of truth. Your husband may have taken a false name and hidden his past, but the way he looked at you across the breakfast table every morning, the way he held your hand during church services, the way his face lit up when you laughed at his stories, those things came from his heart, not from his deception." He paused, struggling to find the right words for a truth he had been grappling with himself during the long months since the war ended. "I think," he continued slowly, "that sometimes people become trapped by their past mistakes and convince themselves that the only way forward is through more deception. Your husband wasn't evil, Margaret. He was a coward, yes, and his choices led to terrible consequences that can never be undone. But at the core of who he was a man who loved you and your boys more than anything else in the world." Margaret was quiet for a long time, absorbing his words and weighing them against the pain that had been consuming her like fire in her chest. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steadier, though still thick with emotion. "What about you, Father? What about your choices? How do I reconcile the man who baptized my children and comforted me through difficult times with the man who helped send those same children to their deaths? How do I separate the priest who has offered me spiritual guidance for 15 years from the spy who betrayed everything he claimed to represent?" It was the question he had been dreading, the one he had no good answer for and knew he never would. But sitting here in the darkness of his church, faced with this woman whose life had been shattered by his choices as much as by her husband's, he knew that only complete honesty could serve them now. "I can't ask you to reconcile those things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't even reconcile them myself. All I can tell you is that the man who baptized your children was the real me, and the man who betrayed their trust was also the real me. We are all capable of both great love and great betrayal, often at the same time, often in service of the same misguided goals." He turned to face her more fully, his eyes reflecting the candlelight that danced across the altar behind them. "The question isn't whether I'm worthy of your forgiveness, Margaret, because I'm not. The question isn't whether I deserve to continue serving as this community's priest, because I don't. The question is whether carrying this anger and pain is serving any purpose in your life now, or whether it's simply another burden that's keeping you from finding whatever peace might still be possible." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. The rage that had sustained her through her confrontation with him was starting to give way to something more complex, something that encompassed not just anger, but also a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that seemed to settle into her very soul. "What choice is that?" she asked. "The choice between letting this knowledge destroy what's left of your life, or finding a way to carry it that allows you to move forward," he said. You can't change what happened, Margaret. You can't bring back your husband or your sons, can't undo the betrayals or erase the lies that shaped your marriage. But you can choose what happens next. You can decide how you want to live the days you have remaining. She walked slowly toward the altar, where candles flickered in their red glass holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to tell stories of their own. The statues of saints looked down at her with carved expressions of serenity and suffering, their painted faces bearing witness to countless human struggles just like hers. Countless souls who had stood in this very spot, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. "I don't know how to move forward," she admitted, her voice echoing in the vaulted space above them. "I don't know how to live with this knowledge. I don't know how to honor the memory of a man who may have been a traitor, or how to grieve for sons who died fighting against their father's true loyalties. I don't know how to trust my own heart when it still loves someone who never really existed." Father McKenna joined her near the altar, both of them bathed in the warm glow of the candlelight that seemed to soften the harsh edges of their pain, if only temporarily. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "the answer isn't to try to make sense of it all at once. Perhaps the answer is simply to keep living, one day at a time, and trust that understanding will come when you're ready for it. Perhaps the answer is to accept that love and betrayal can exist side by side, that people can be both heroes and villains, often in the very same actions." Margaret turned to look at him, studying his face in the flickering light, seeing in his weathered features the accumulated weight of his own struggles and compromises. "What about you, Father? What will you do with your knowledge? Will you continue to serve this parish, knowing what you've done? Will you stand in that pulpit next Sunday and preach about redemption and forgiveness while carrying the blood of 14 men on your hands?" It was a question he'd been asking himself every day since the war ended, a question that had kept him awake through countless nights as he stared at the ceiling of his modest quarters and wondered whether he had any right to continue serving as shepherd to a flock he had helped to scatter and diminish. "I think," he said slowly, the words coming to him as he spoke them, rather than from any prepared response, "that I need to find a way to make amends. Not by fleeing from my responsibilities or hiding from what I've done, but by dedicating whatever time I have left to serving this community in a way that honors the memory of the men who died because of my choices." Yeah, he gestured toward the windows that faced the cemetery where so many of their townspeople lay buried, their headstones visible in the moonlight like ghostly sentinels standing guard over the dead. "I can't bring back the dead, Margaret. Neither of us can undo the past or erase the consequences of the choices that were made by us and for us and around us. But we can choose to live in a way that makes their sacrifice meaningful. We can choose to build something good from the wreckage of our mistakes." Margaret was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the cross that hung above the altar, the painted figure of Christ looking down with an expression that seemed to encompass both infinite suffering and infinite compassion. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been so angry," she said. "For months, even before I learned the truth about Thomas and about you, I've been carrying this rage that I didn't even understand. I was angry at God for taking my family, angry at the war for destroying our lives, angry at myself for surviving when they didn't. But now I know what I was really angry about." She paused, gathering her thoughts like someone collecting scattered pieces of a broken mirror, trying to see if they could somehow be fitted back together into something that made sense. "I was angry because I thought my love had been pure and simple and honest, while everything around me was complicated and ugly and false. Learning the truth about Thomas, about you, about all of it, it's taken away the one thing I thought I could count. I was angry because I thought my love had been pure and simple and honest, while everything around me was complicated and ugly and false. Learning the truth about Thomas, about you, about all of it, It's taken away the one thing I thought I could count on in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything beautiful and sacred." She turned back toward the pew where her shawl lay draped across the wooden back, then paused and looked at the priest once more, her eyes reflecting the candlelight like pools of dark water touched by starlight. "And now," Father McKenna asked gently, sensing that she was working toward some kind of resolution, some way of carrying the burden she had been given. "Now I'm learning that love is never pure or simple," she said, a note of something that might have been acceptance creeping into her voice like the first hint of dawn after a long, dark night. "Love exists in the midst of lies and betrayal and moral compromise. It exists anyway, despite everything that should destroy it, despite all the reasons why it makes no sense to continue feeling it." She moved toward the door, her footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floor, each step seeming to carry her further away from the woman who had knocked on the church door hours earlier, and closer to someone she didn't yet recognize, but was beginning to understand. "I won't pretend that I forgive you, Father," she said with quiet dignity, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had looked into the depths of human nature and emerged with a clearer understanding of both its capacity for evil and its potential for redemption. "I'm not ready for that, and I may never be. The men who died because of your choices deserve better than easy absolution, and their families deserve to know that their sacrifice wasn't dismissed or forgotten." Father McKenna nodded, understanding that this was more grace than he had any right to expect, and more than he would have granted himself if their positions had been reversed. "But I also won't let your choices destroy whatever peace I might find in the time I have left," she continued. "I won't give you that power over my future, just as I won't give my husband's deceptions the power to erase the years of genuine happiness we shared before the war tore everything apart." She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, preparing to step back out into the cold night that awaited her beyond the church walls. "What will you do now?" Father McKenna asked, his voice heavy with genuine concern for this woman who had already endured more than any person should be asked to bear. Margaret paused with her hand on the door latch, considering the question that she had been avoiding since Sergeant Hayes had appeared at her door with his terrible burden of truth. "I'm going to go home," she said finally. "I'm going to sit by my fire and read the rest of that letter, the parts where Jonathan Hartwell writes about loving me and missing me and wishing he could have been the man I thought he was. And I'm going to try to figure out how to love a ghost who never really existed, while somehow still being grateful for the years we had together." She opened the door slightly, letting in a gust of cold air that made the candle flames dance wildly and sent shadows writhing across the walls like spirits trying to escape their earthly bonds. "And tomorrow," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I'm going to decide whether to keep coming to your church or find another place to worship. Tonight has shown me that I need to take responsibility for my own spiritual life, instead of simply trusting others to guide me toward truth and righteousness." Father McKenna watched as she prepared to leave, knowing that this conversation had changed both of them in ways that would take months or years to fully understand. "Margaret," he called softly, and she turned back to look at him one final time. "For what it's worth, I believe your husband truly loved you. Whatever else he was, whatever else he did, that love was real. It was the most honest thing about him, even in the midst of all his deceptions." She stood silhouetted in the doorway for a moment, her slight figure framed by the darkness beyond, looking like a saint in a medieval painting, someone who had been tested by fire and emerged transformed but not destroyed. "I know," she said simply, her voice carrying a weight of acceptance that seemed to encompass not just her husband's love, but all the complexities and contradictions that made up human experience. "And that's what makes it so hard to bear. If he had never loved me at all, if our marriage had been nothing but a convenient fiction, it would be easier to simply hate him and move on. But knowing that his love was real, that our happiness together was genuine, even though it was built on lies, that makes forgiveness and condemnation equally impossible. Then she was gone, disappearing into the night that had brought her to his door with her terrible burden of truth. Father McKenna stood alone in his church, surrounded by the flickering shadows of candlelight and the weight of his own reckoning, listening to her footsteps fade away until there was nothing left but the sound of wind howling through the bare branches of the oak trees and the distant tolling of the church bell, marking the passage of time. In the days that followed Margaret's midnight visit, the weight of their conversation seemed to settle over the town of Millbrook, like a heavy blanket that muffled sound and made everything feel different, charged with new significance. Word of Thomas Caldwell's true identity and fate began to spread through the community, carried on whispers and hushed conversations that died whenever Margaret appeared. But the revelation seemed to affect people in unexpected ways. Rather than shunning her as the wife of a traitor, as she had feared they might, the townspeople seemed to draw closer around her, perhaps recognizing that they all carried secrets and compromises from the war years, that they had all made choices they weren't proud of in order to survive. The war had taught them that moral certainty was a luxury few could afford, that good people were sometimes forced to do terrible things, and that judgment was a burden too heavy for anyone to carry alone. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, whose own son had died at Antietam, began appearing at Margaret's door with baskets of food and offers to help with household chores. She never mentioned Thomas's deception directly, but her presence seemed to communicate an understanding that went beyond words, that loss was loss, regardless of the circumstances that caused it, and that grief deserved compassion even when it was complicated by betrayal. Young Timothy Morrison, whose brother Peter had died in the ambush that Father McKenna's intelligence had made possible, struggled with anger and confusion when he learned the truth. But after several sleepless nights, wrestling with his desire for revenge, he found himself standing at Margaret's gate one morning, not entirely sure why he had come, but knowing that he needed to see her face, to try to understand how she was carrying her burden. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said when she answered his tentative knock, his voice cracking slightly with the emotion he was trying to control. "I heard about what you learned, about your husband, and about Father McKenna." Margaret invited him in, pouring him coffee with hands that had grown steadier over the past week as she learned to navigate her new reality. They sat in her small parlor, surrounded by the remnants of her life with Thomas, photographs on the mantel, his reading chair by the window, the quilt she had made for their 5th wedding anniversary still draped over the back of the sofa. "I keep thinking I should hate you," Timothy said finally, his young face twisted with confusion and pain. "Your husband's information might have been what got Peter killed. But when I look at you, when I see how much you're hurting too, I can't seem to hold on to that anger." Margaret set down her coffee cup with careful precision, choosing her words with the same deliberate care. "Your brother was a good man, Timothy," she said quietly. "He didn't deserve to die because of choices that other people made without his knowledge or consent. If hating me would bring him back or make your pain easier to bear, I would gladly accept that hatred. But I don't think it will do either of those things." They sat in silence for a while, both of them staring out the window at the bare branches of the apple tree in Margaret's yard, its limbs stark against the grey November sky. "What are you going to do?" Timothy asked eventually. "Are you going to stay in Millbrook? Are you going to keep going to Father McKenna's church?" Margaret had been asking herself the same questions every day since her midnight confrontation with the priest. The simple answers: to flee, to start over somewhere else where no one knew her story, to find a new church where she could worship without being reminded of betrayal, seemed increasingly inadequate as she thought about what running away would actually accomplish. "I'm going to stay," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "This is my home, Timothy. These are my people, even if some of them have disappointed me terribly. Running away won't change what happened, and it won't help me figure out how to live with what I've learned." She looked at the young man sitting across from her, seeing in his face some of the same confusion and pain that she carried, the same struggle to make sense of a world that seemed determined to resist easy categorization. "As for Father McKenna," she continued, "I'm still deciding about that. I went to church last Sunday, but I sat in the back instead of my usual pew, and I listened to his sermon about redemption with different ears. I'm not sure I can ever trust him the way I used to, but I'm also not sure that complete trust was ever what faith was supposed to be about." Timothy nodded slowly, processing her words with the seriousness of someone who was being forced to grow up faster than he had expected. "My ma says that the war changed everybody," he said. "She says that none of us are the same people we were before it started, and maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe we needed to learn that life is more complicated than we thought it was." Margaret felt a small smile tug at the corners of her mouth, the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. "Your mother is a wise woman," she said, "and you're going to be a wise man if you keep thinking about things the way you are now." Under tea, after Timothy left, Margaret found herself standing in front of the mirror in her bedroom, studying her reflection with new eyes. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had existed before Sergeant Hayes knocked on her door with his burden of letters and revelations. She was thinner, more angular, with lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult reckonings. But there was also something else in her face now, a kind of strength that came from having survived the worst kind of betrayal and chosen not to let it destroy her completely. She opened the wooden box where she kept her most precious possessions and withdrew Jonathan Hartwell's letter, reading through it again with eyes that were learning to see past the immediate pain of deception to something more complex underneath. His words about loving her despite the lies, about finding genuine happiness in their marriage even though it was built on false foundations, began to take on new meaning as she allowed herself to consider the possibility that truth and falsehood might not be as mutually exclusive as she had always believed. That evening, as she sat by her fire with mending in her lap, Margaret heard a soft knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Father McKenna standing on her porch, his face etched with lines of exhaustion and uncertainty. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice carefully formal, "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to speak with you about something, a proposal that I've been considering since our conversation in the church." She invited him in, though she remained standing rather than offering him a seat, maintaining a distance that spoke to the fundamental change in their relationship. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his hands clasped behind his back as if he were delivering a sermon. "About making amends, about finding a way to honor the memory of the men who died because of the choices that were made. By your husband, by me, by all of us who allowed ourselves to be trapped in webs of compromise and deception." Margaret waited for him to continue, her expression neutral but attentive. "I want to help you establish something here in Millbrook," he said, the words coming in a rush as if he had been rehearsing them. "A memorial, or a scholarship fund, or some other way of acknowledging both the courage and the failures of the men who fought. Something that doesn't gloss over the complexity of what they experienced, that doesn't try to turn them into perfect heroes or irredeemable villains." He paused, gathering his courage for what came next. "I also want to confess publicly to what I did during the war. I want to tell the congregation the truth about my role in passing information to the Confederates, about the men who died because of my cowardice and moral weakness. I want to give them the opportunity to decide for themselves whether I should continue to serve as their priest." Margaret felt something shift in her chest as she listened to his proposal, something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness, though she wasn't ready to name it that yet. "That would destroy you," she said quietly. "The scandal would end your career, probably force you to leave Millbrook entirely. Are you prepared for that?" Father McKenna met her gaze directly for the first time since he had entered her home. "I'm prepared for whatever consequences come from telling the truth," he said. "I've spent months trying to find ways to atone for my sins in private, but I'm beginning to understand that private penance isn't enough. The families of the men who died deserve to know what happened to their sons and husbands. They deserve the opportunity to forgive me or condemn me based on full knowledge of my actions." Margaret walked to her window and looked out at the church steeple, visible above the bare trees, thinking about all the Sundays she had sat in those pews listening to sermons about courage and sacrifice, while the man delivering them carried secrets that would have shattered her faith if she had known them. "What about the memorial?" she asked. "What did you have in mind?" "I thought perhaps we could establish a fund to help the widows and orphans in our community," he said. "Not just those whose husbands and fathers died heroically, but all of them, regardless of the circumstances of their loss. And perhaps we could create some kind of historical record, an honest accounting of what the war cost our town, including the moral compromises and difficult choices that people were forced to make." He moved closer to the window where she stood, both of them looking out at the cemetery where so many of their friends and neighbors lay buried. "I know it won't bring back the dead," he continued, "and I know it won't erase the pain that you and Timothy Morrison and all the others are carrying, but it might help ensure that future generations understand the full cost of war, not just the lives that were lost, but the ways that ordinary people were forced to betray their deepest values in order to survive." Margaret was quiet for a long time, considering his proposal and weighing it against her own need for justice, and her growing understanding that justice might be more complicated than simple punishment. "I'll help you," she said finally. "Not because I forgive you, I'm not ready for that yet, and I may never be, but because you're right, that the families deserve to know the truth, and because I think honoring the complexity of what people went through is more important than protecting comfortable lies." She turned to face him directly, her expression serious but no longer filled with the burning anger that had characterized their first confrontation. "But I have conditions," she continued. "When you make your confession to the congregation, you're going to tell them everything, not just about passing information to the Confederates, but about your abandoned family in Richmond, about the lies that brought you to the priesthood in the first place. If we're going to have truth, we're going to have all of it." Father McKenna nodded, his face pale but resolute. "And," Margaret continued, "you're going to help me write letters to the families of the men who died because of your intelligence. Personal letters explaining what happened and giving them the opportunity to respond however they see fit. Some of them may want to forgive you, and others may want to see you hanged for treason. Either way, they deserve the choice." The priest felt tears prick at his eyes as he contemplated the magnitude of what she was asking, but he knew she was right. The easy path of private guilt and secret penance had led him nowhere except deeper into his own self-loathing. If there was to be any hope of redemption, it would have to come through the much more difficult path of public confession and genuine accountability. "I agree to your conditions," he said, "all of them." Margaret moved away from the window and began preparing tea, her movements efficient and purposeful as she processed the implications of their agreement. "We'll start with the letters," she said. "I have the names of the men who died in that ambush. Timothy Morrison gave them to me yesterday. We'll write to each family individually, and we'll tell them the truth about what happened to their sons and husbands." She paused in her preparations and looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. "And then," she continued, "you're going to help me figure out how to honor Thomas's memory without dishonoring the men he betrayed. Because as angry as I am about his deceptions, as much as his choices have shattered my understanding of our marriage, he was still my husband. He was still the father of my children, and I refuse to let his mistakes erase the good things he did or the love we shared." Father McKenna felt a complex mixture of relief and terror as he contemplated the path they were embarking upon together. It would not be easy, and it would likely cost him everything he had built in Millbrook over the past 2 decades. But for the first time since Captain Reynolds had first approached him with his blackmail scheme, he felt something like hope stirring in his chest. Over the following weeks, Margaret and Father McKenna worked together on the difficult task of crafting letters to the families of the men who had died as a result of the intelligence he had provided. Each letter was a careful balance of honesty and compassion, acknowledging the full scope of the betrayal while also trying to convey the genuine remorse that the priest felt for his actions. The responses they received varied dramatically. Some families wrote back with forgiveness, understanding that war had forced impossible choices on everyone, and that Father McKenna's guilt and willingness to confess publicly were evidence of his fundamental decency despite his failures. Others responded with anger and demands for justice, calling for him to be prosecuted for treason or at minimum expelled from the priesthood and banished from Virginia entirely. Mrs. Catherine Webb, mother of David Webb, who had died in the ambush, wrote a letter that Margaret would keep for the rest of her life. "Father McKenna, your confession has opened wounds that I thought had begun to heal, but I find that I am grateful for the truth, even though it brings fresh pain. My David died believing he was serving a righteous cause, and knowing that he was betrayed by someone he trusted does not diminish his courage or the rightness of his sacrifice. I do not forgive you. That is not within my power or my inclination. But I also do not hate you, because hatred would poison what remains of my life without bringing my son back or serving any useful purpose. I hope that you will find a way to live with what you have done that honors the memory of the men who died, and I pray that God will have mercy on your soul, even if I cannot." Catherine Webb. Other letters were less measured in their responses. The Morrison family demanded that Father McKenna face criminal charges for treason, and several other families threatened to leave the church entirely if he remained as their priest. But there were also letters, like the one from the widow of Sergeant James Crawford, who wrote that she was grateful to finally understand why her husband had seemed so troubled in his final letter home, and that knowing the truth allowed her to grieve for him more fully. As word of Father McKenna's planned confession spread through Millbrook, the town became divided between those who felt he should be given the opportunity to make amends and those who believed that some betrayals were unforgivable. Margaret found herself at the center of these debates, with people seeking her opinion on whether the priest deserved forgiveness or condemnation. "What he did was terrible," she told Mrs. Patterson one afternoon as they worked together on preparations for the memorial fund. "But what my husband did was terrible too, and I'm learning that terrible actions don't necessarily make people entirely evil. They make them tragically human." The Sunday chosen for Father McKenna's public confession dawned grey and cold, with a bitter wind that seemed to cut through even the heaviest coats. The church was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding into every available space. Word had spread beyond Millbrook, and visitors from neighboring towns had come to witness what many saw as a moment of unprecedented moral reckoning. Margaret sat in her usual pew near the front, wearing her best black dress and carrying herself with a dignity that seemed to command respect from everyone around her. She had agonized over whether to attend at all, but ultimately decided that her presence was necessary, not to show support for Father McKenna, but to bear witness to the truth that was finally being spoken. When Father McKenna rose to address the congregation, the silence was so complete that the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor seemed to echo like thunder. He stood behind the pulpit where he had delivered hundreds of sermons over the years, his hands gripping the worn wood as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "My dear friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed sanctuary, "I stand before you today not as your spiritual leader, but as a man who has failed you in the most fundamental ways. I stand before you as a liar, a betrayer, and a coward who allowed his own weakness to cost the lives of good men who trusted me with their deepest fears and most private thoughts." A murmur ran through the congregation, though most had already heard rumors of what was to come. "For 2 years during our recent war," he continued, "I passed information to Confederate forces, information that I gathered from confessions and conversations with Union soldiers who came to me seeking spiritual guidance. 14 men died as a direct result of intelligence I provided, including 2 sons of this very community, Peter Morrison and David Webb." The silence that followed was broken by a sob from Mrs. Morrison, who had come despite her family's anger, perhaps needing to hear the truth spoken aloud before she could begin to process it. Father McKenna went on to detail his entire history of deception, from abandoning his family in Richmond to lying about his qualifications for the priesthood, to allowing himself to be blackmailed into betraying his sacred vows. He spoke without trying to justify his actions or minimize their consequences, presenting the facts with the stark honesty that Margaret had insisted upon. When he finished, he stepped down from the pulpit and walked to the front pew where Margaret sat, extending his hand to help her rise. "Mrs. Margaret Caldwell has suffered losses as great as any in our community," he said, his voice now thick with emotion. "She has lost her husband and both her sons to this war, and she has recently learned truths about her husband's service that have added betrayal to her grief. Yet she has chosen to work with me in establishing a memorial fund and historical record that will honor all of our war dead honestly, without trying to hide the moral complexity of the choices they were forced to make." Margaret stood beside him, her presence lending weight to his words, even as her expression remained carefully neutral. "I do not ask for your forgiveness," Father McKenna concluded. "I do not deserve it, and seeking it would be another form of selfishness on my part. I ask only that you decide whether the truth I have finally chosen to tell can serve some useful purpose, whether the memorial we propose can help ensure that future generations understand the full cost of war and the importance of moral courage in the face of impossible choices." The questions and accusations that followed were intense and often painful. Some congregation members demanded his immediate resignation, while others argued that his willingness to confess publicly demonstrated a genuine repentance that deserved consideration. The debate continued for hours, with voices raised in anger and passion as the community wrestled with how to respond to revelations that challenged their understanding of moral authority and spiritual leadership. In the end, the congregation voted to accept Father McKenna's resignation from his position as their priest, while allowing him to remain in Millbrook as a private citizen who would continue to work on the memorial project. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but reflected the complex emotions and divided loyalties that his confession had revealed. As the months passed and spring returned to the Virginia hills, the memorial fund that Margaret and Father McKenna had established began to make a real difference in the lives of the town's widows and orphans. More importantly, the process of creating an honest historical record of Millbrook's experience during the war opened conversations about moral complexity and human fallibility that many found surprisingly healing. Margaret never did forgive Father McKenna in any conventional sense, but she found that working alongside him on their shared project allowed her to see him as something more complex than simply the man who had betrayed her trust. She began to understand that people could be simultaneously worthy of condemnation and deserving of compassion, that moral judgment was often less important than finding ways to live constructively with the consequences of human failure. On a warm evening in late May, nearly a year after her midnight visit to the church, Margaret stood in her garden, tending to the flowers that had finally begun to bloom again after a hard winter. The letter from Jonathan Hartwell still sat in her wooden box of treasures, but she no longer read it every night, as she had in the early months after its arrival. The pain of his deception had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more manageable, a permanent part of her story that no longer threatened to consume her entirely. Thomas McKenna, no longer Father McKenna, appeared at her gate as the sun was setting, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked along the way. "For the memorial garden," he said simply, offering her the flowers. "Mrs. Webb thought you might like them for the section dedicated to the men who died at Antietam." Margaret accepted the flowers with a nod of thanks, noting how much he had aged in the months since his confession. He looked older, more fragile, but also somehow more at peace than he had in years. "How are you doing, Thomas?" she asked, using his first name as she had taken to doing since he was no longer her priest. "I'm learning to live with myself," he said honestly. "Some days are better than others, but I'm grateful for the work we're doing together, and I'm grateful that you chose not to let my failures destroy you along with me." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the mountains and listening to the sound of children playing in the distance, a sound that had been rare during the war years, but was becoming more common as the community slowly healed. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked. "Telling the truth, I mean, destroying the life you had built here." Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret the choices that made the truth necessary," he said. "I regret the pain that my confession caused to people who had already suffered enough. But I don't regret the telling itself. Living with lies was killing me slowly, Margaret. The truth has been difficult, but it's also been liberating in ways I didn't expect." Margaret nodded, understanding what he meant more than she might have a year earlier. "I keep thinking about something you said that night in the church," she told him. "About love existing despite deception, not because of truth. I'm beginning to think you were right about that." She looked down at the flowers in her hands, their simple beauty somehow more precious because of their impermanence. "I still love Jonathan," she continued, using her husband's real name for the first time without feeling like she was betraying Thomas Caldwell's memory. "I love him for the happiness he gave me and the children he helped me raise and the way he held me when I was afraid. The fact that he was living a lie doesn't make that love less real or less valuable." Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes as he listened to her words, understanding that she was offering him something precious, not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of acceptance that allowed both of them to move forward without being trapped by the weight of past failures. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for helping me find a way to live with what I've done, for showing me that redemption might be possible even when forgiveness isn't." As darkness fell over Millbrook and the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Margaret Caldwell stood in her garden, surrounded by flowers that would bloom and fade and bloom again, understanding finally that life was like that too, full of endings that were also beginnings, full of losses that somehow made room for new kinds of love. The truth had indeed shattered her soul, just as she had told Father McKenna that night in the church. But from those broken pieces, she had built something new, not a return to innocence, which was impossible, but a kind of wisdom that could only come from facing the worst truths about the people we love, and choosing to continue loving them anyway, choosing to continue living anyway, choosing to find meaning anyway, in a world that seemed determined to resist all our attempts to make sense of it. And in that choice, the choice to keep living, to keep loving, to keep building something beautiful from the wreckage of what had been destroyed, Margaret found not the happiness she had once known, but something perhaps more valuable, the strength to carry both joy and sorrow, both love and betrayal, both faith and doubt, all at the same time, without being crushed by the weight of their contradictions.